Good evening. I guess it's working. My name is Susan Amos Palmer. I'm the director of the Growing Through Loss program and representing the North Suburban Grief Coalition. My parish is St. John the Baptist in New Brighton. This parish is also a member of the coalition, so all of the people that are helping to put the program on are from the different churches that were listed in our brochure. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to do an opening reading out of this book that's called Praying Out Goodbyes by Joyce Rupp. Our God is a God who dwells within, a loving presence near to us, who yearns for our happiness, one who walks with us in our struggles. If our God is a God who holds us close as a mother hen gathered through chicks close to her, then we will come through our goodbyes with a deeper sense of being tenderly cared for by our God, and we will draw comfort and strength from this presence. As Kushner writes, we can't pray that God will make our lives free of problems. This won't happen, and it is probably just as well. But people who pray for courage, for strength to bear the unbearable, for the grace to remember that what they have left instead of what they have lost, very often find their prayers answered. They discover that they have more strength, more courage than they ever knew themselves to have. Where did they get it? I would like to think that their prayers helped them find that strength. Their prayers helped them tap reserves of faith and courage which were not available to them before. Ted Bowman is a trainer, consultant, and educator. He is the author of numerous books and articles and book chapters. He is a father and a stepfather and a grandfather. He is also a spouse, son, and brother. Ted grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and has lived in the Twin Cities for the past 30 years. As an educator, he specializes in change and transition and the resulting grief and loss. He is also in an ordained ministry in the Moravian Church. Tonight, he's here to talk with us about understanding grief. Please welcome Ted Bowman.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a treat and an honor to be with you as we together think about the losses and the grief in our lives from the beginning until recently. And I hope that my words can help you to raise your consciousness about some of those losses and some of the resources that might be beneficial to us as we deal with these losses in our lives. Would you turn, being safe, wave to people near you, or say something and say, thank you for being here? Would you give them a signal? Would you say that to one another around the room there? That's the short version of the session in case you take an early nap this evening. It comes from Bob Vaninga, now a professor emeritus in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. And years ago, he wrote that those who get through a tragedy, those who get through a rough patch in their lives, those who deal with adversity well, point at least to one person who stood by them, supported them, and gave them a sense of hope. So at its best, it's what we call families. and asbestos what we call neighbors, and asbestos what we call communities, congregations, and it's also the reason that this ministry was formed now 30 years ago or so, these grief coalitions all around the Twin Cities, that we all do better when we all do better. And we learn some things from each other about supportive care for ourselves and for one another, and that helps us to move forward with what's happening in our lives. So I've been asked, because this is the first of this particular series, to help us review. No matter if you've been a regular participant in other sites or even over the years, it's important for me, for you, for all of us to review and to discern what are our resources, what do we know about our loss and grief, how do we cope, how do we move forward. And so I'm going to go over some of the core principles with you this evening and invite a bit of discussion before you move into the groups in about 40 minutes. First, some wisdom from the 13th century. I don't think there's anyone in the room that old. This is from a Middle Eastern poet by the name of Rumi, and it's wisdom from way back that also has efficacy today. He used the metaphor that this being human is a guest house. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. And then an arc of life, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. In other words, things happen in our lives. I'm guessing if I were sitting near you and we were to have a chat right now, some of you could give me the hour, the day, the month, and the year that something happened in your life. When some of you women or men felt a lump in the breast, when you began to get that call from someone about a death in the family, when you were told that you were redundant at work, when your parents announced that they were moving towards separation and divorce, I want you to begin to think about these guests that arrive in our guest house. The next line of the poem was countercultural in the 13th century and regrettably still is to some extent even here in the 21st century. The next line of the poem is welcome and entertain them all. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Rumi was not saying spin or rose-colored glasses, look on the bright side, you'll get over this, move on. Rather, even something tragic, even something that's hard to live with, how do I embrace it? How do I face it? How do I begin to deal with something that I had hoped would not happen? And so these things happen. Some of them slowly. Let me read a piece about my mom from my most recent book of ambiguous parables. His mom was moving further and further into the fog of dementia. The Alzheimer's came first. Later came her stroke, robbing her diamonds and pearls. She lost the past and her left side, the stories she loved and her mobility. Still she smiled. I love you. You're a handsome fellow. Oh, so good. Your hands feel so warm. A smile can soften the blow, especially a genuine love of people and of life. No doubt there was also grief and loneliness and abject fear, but those she kept tucked away, not for public display, allowing her smile to fill the room. And then my final stanza of this poem. Some of you have experienced these long deaths, the death before the death that occurs. It makes her dying harder and easier. Our tears blend with smiles, grief, and unexpected joy overflow. So Rumi's not talking about speed necessarily. Some of the losses of our lives are slowly coming, growing, progressive medical or mental health conditions as we know of them and things that are happening in our lives. Others happen quite rapidly. Here again is my story, and I'm sharing my story not because mine is the model you should follow, but I'm trying to help you to think about your own stories. March 6th is a date that you may know, 2020. It was the first confirmed case of COVID here in Minnesota. On July 29th, just 4 or 5 months later, this happened for me and my household. Bereavement, in my case, was sudden. Cardiac arrest doesn't stand in a queue waiting for a vaccine that may or may not make a difference. She died as she cried about the pain in her chest. I embraced my dying wife, seeking clarity about what was happening, only to discover that she was already going somewhere else, leaving me to read emails and sit in gardens and open condolence cards. My wife of 41 years died suddenly of cardiac arrest. With no precursor of heart disease, no precursor of pain in the chest except the call from the bathroom as I was preparing dinner. There's a pain in my chest. And I went running, and she was already going and gone. Sometimes it happens that fast. Some of you know those kinds of stories as well. The late John Bratner, one of our first grief speakers and educators here in Minnesota, wrote years ago and spoke years ago. He said, "You'd think we'd be better at this stuff. You'd think we'd be better at this stuff." And then he went on to elaborate. He said, a child being born is the first separation, the first ending. You women know this much better than we men. And so a child then seemingly goes through endless acts of separation and endings thereafter. You'd think we'd be better at this stuff. And yet, look around the room. Most of us are of a certain age, and we probably have had many of these episodes of a joy, a depression, a meanness coming to our homes. How do we begin to cope and welcome, as Rumi said, whatever comes, and embrace it? We'll get a little bit of a clue of courage, perhaps an insight from the poet Mary Oliver, who in this case did anticipatory grieving, looking ahead to the losses that might come. And a famous poem that you may know of hers, "When Death Comes." When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me, snaps his purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like the iceberg between the shoulder blades, think of all the ways we describe it, all the euphemisms and the metaphors that we use. I want to step, listen to her, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering what it's going to be like, the dying and the death process. All my life, I've been a bride to amazement. I've been the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I've made what I've made of my life like something particular or real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened and full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited the world. When death comes, I want to enter the door full of curiosity. I wonder if you or I can say that about our aging, about whatever are your losses of this evening. Can we be a bit curious? Can we embrace the ambiguity, the mystery of what's happening? I sat with a couple this morning. The man is moving progressively into living with Parkinson's. His wife is also progressively living with Parkinson's because she lives with him. It's the same that happened with Mom. We first thought that she was the one that had Alzheimer's. We realized after about 2 years that we all had Alzheimer's. It's a family condition. So we had to begin to embrace the curiosity of what was it going to be like to be with a mother who was living with this forgetfulness, this lack of organization, some of the signs, as some of you know, of things that are happening. So how do we respond? Well, grandfather had died, and a grandson about 8 years of age came over to his granny's house a few days after the funeral. and ask one of those questions that seemingly only 6 or 7 or 8-year-olds can ask. I hope that you'll ask it in the groups in just a bit. Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa? Or do you never want to talk about Grandpa? How's that for a question? Do you ever or do you never? The grandmother realized this was a threshold for a 6 or 7-year-old, one of those first major deaths in a child's life, and wanted to get it right. And so here's a response. See if you can embrace what she advises to her grandson. There are times when I need to talk about him very much, when it helps me. But I suppose there are other times when I feel that I can't, either because it hurts too much or because it feels private at that particular moment. But on the whole, I want to talk. Would you give her a thumbs up? Absolutely. I would give her a thumbs up, not only for a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old, but for all of us. That it's important that we name the name. We say the words. We embrace some of what is happening in our lives. And so the boy sat and digested this in silence and then gave his granny a brilliant smile. I see. So it's hard to do what you feel like, right? Well, she was a little reluctant to say a hard yes or no, but she said kind of a tentative yes. Well, I'm ready. Let's talk about it now. We need some of those people in our lives, don't we also? That someone says, as they have said to me, Ted, I knew Marge in a different way than you, of course, as her spouse and husband of 41 years. I'm curious about your story. How about you're curious about mine? Let's share stories. So we began to introduce ourselves to one another around a common person that was part of our lives, in this case, my wife and their friend or their colleague. But some people have trouble talking about these things or want to impose a kind of language. And so again, I'm trying to help us think about what do we want and need, and how do we respond when people say some things to us that are a bit off-putting. Barbara Abercrombie had her husband die a few years ago, and she had a love of words and wanted to respond to her husband's death, and she found that while her friends were very compassionate, some of their words were a bit offensive for her. The language of condolence, no matter how well intended, irritated me. I wonder if you've been irritated recently. My husband had not gone to a better place, as if he were off on a holiday. Think about what we say. He's gone to a better place. He had not passed like clouds overhead, that kind of thing, nor was he my late husband, as if he had missed a train. I had not lost him, as if I had been careless. Lost. And sure, none of this was for the best. My husband was dead. So she's wanting us to be open to using real words and to be willing to talk about that. She says, I know, of course, that euphemism was offered in kindness, and I was grateful for friends who had any attempt to comfort me, but what I really wanted was the language of hard truth and reality. So for someone who can be with us and say, not only how are you doing? I must have been asked that, and I still am asked it, but was probably asked that, who knows, 500 times in the first year after Marge died. And there was a time when I didn't know how to respond. Was I to talk about the last 5 minutes? This afternoon? This week? This month? What does the question imply? How am I doing? Because I came and go from loss and grief, and we'll talk about that a bit more. So I invited people to say, I'm glad you're interested. I wonder if you can be a bit more specific. Is there something that you're wanting to know about my story or about Marge's story? Or are you curious about how I'm coping? Because about 6 months after she died, I wanted to brag, because I'd cleaned the oven. In our division of labor for 41 years, I don't know how we got it sorted out, but for some reason she cleaned the oven. I did some other things. And then she died on me, and I didn't know how to clean the oven. And so I wanted to brag about cleaning the oven. I wanted to move people over to it, show them, and see if they could inspect it and see if I'd done a good job and all of those things. And so can we invite some of the stories and laugh a little bit even as we cry? Am I making some sense? It's all of these things that are part of our stories. So let me go a bit further and help us to be sure that we distinguish between losses and grieving. Losses and grieving. Here's a definition that I use around loss. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. See, if you go on the streets after this session today, stop at a market or get some gas or something and ask people to free associate on the words grief and loss, about 65% of the people will say something about death and dying. That's the association lots of people have. But I'm guessing that you can agree with me that loss is much more than the death of the person, that we also lose other things. I'm now a widower. I'm now a solo man. I'm now single. I now have had to learn how to clean an oven. My wife had lots of opinions during her life, and there were times in our marriage I didn't like her opinions. Now I miss them. It'd be nice to have someone around to give me some feedback about the dinner I just cooked, or about the local news, or the talk that I gave at the Grief Coalition up in Roseville, or any of that. And I look around and she's not there. So it's losing touch, it's losing stories, it's losing history. It's also that she was much more of an extrovert than I am. And so I've had to learn some social skills because she was always a gatherer. I see some people in the room who are part of some of Marge's groups. I was often hoping to come home to just a quiet dinner with Marge, and there were 3 or 4 people in the household already, because she just loved being around other people. And if anybody said, "Could I just stop over for a cup of coffee? Could we talk?" Of course, of course. So losses are these range of losses. Let me even go a little bit further. I can't see each of you really well because of the lights here in the room, but there are some of us in the room, and you had some of that even with Susan a few moments ago with her walker, that some of us tonight are showing conspicuous losses. I have a sight loss, so I'm wearing glasses. So some of our losses are conspicuous. Even deaths were not conspicuous at times during COVID because we didn't have in-person funerals. Think about the difference between conspicuous losses when someone retires or someone's made redundant and their car does not leave the driveway. Because of that, we know something conspicuous has happened. Some people with cancer lose their hair. Some people use walkers. But as I look out into the room, there are many of you who also are experiencing what I would call loss of dreams, loss of the future story, loss of the pictures of the way your life was supposed to be at this time. And as I look out in the room, I have no clue who has those internal losses. And so some losses are conspicuous, but some are internal, having to do with safety, having to do with dignity, having to do with self-respect, having to do with think about COVID, and we've lost our security. We're dealing almost daily still with ambiguity. How many of us, as we walked in this building this evening, mine's laying over here on the bench, was wearing a mask? Do I wear a mask to this particular coalition? Will I be safe here? There's even a sign on the door to say, as you are doing very well, would you at least sit 6 feet apart or so? We're still dealing with the ambiguity. Those are internal losses. And some people are more frightened by that than others. So losses, I want you to, in the group tonight, to begin to name some of the losses, not just the death of the person, but some of the losses that are associated with that. And then the body's natural response, both voluntarily and involuntarily, is to grieve it. And that's confusing itself because it involves our whole body. Our whole body grieves at moments like these. Part of it can be emotional. That's the sadness, the tears, the rage, the anger, all of the emotions that we may have that come and go. But it's also cognitive. How fast was he driving? What does stage 4 cancer mean? Cardiac arrest? Do we have enough insurance? What about the funeral? Do we go ahead with this? Can we pay for it? All of those informational and cognitive questions that we have. And it's a spiritual response to loss. What kind of God? Does this make sense? Is it fair? How do we fit it into our worldview? What some writers call meaning making. And then it's a physical response to loss. Why am I so tired? I'm just not thinking clearly these days. It's not only a sign that you might have a medical or mental health condition, but our whole body can be grieving because we've lost our routines. We've lost our routines. 41 years for me sleeping in the same bed with this woman, and it took me a long time to want to go to bed at night. So was I sleeping well? Probably not. Was I eating well? Well, fairly well. That became one of my luxuries of the day, to try to take care of myself. Was I exercising? Probably not as well as I could or should. And so the grieving goes on. And it's confusing. You may know the story of C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, one of the Renaissance men in English literature and teaching. And he married late in life, and his wife died, if I remember correctly, 3 or 4 years after they got married, an American woman. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow turned out not to be a state, but a process. It needs not a map nor a history, but if I don't stop writing or saying that history at some quite arbitrary point, there's no reason why I should ever stop. There's something new to be chronicled every day, and he's going on about the grieving process. We're going to talk a little bit later about continuing bonds, about how it continues to go on and on. A similar English man, W.H. Auden, talked about the losses in his famous poem, Funeral Blues. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, think about what's happening right now in England with the Queen. Prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the monument, let the mourners come. Let airplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky, the message, he is dead. He was my north, my south, my east, my west, my working week, my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would go on forever. I was wrong. There's the grieving, the loss of that kind of companionship again. The importance of talking, just back to the grandpa. I want to urge you to also use the person's name. And the story let me associate with that. I do some work at Crescent Cove, which is a pediatric palliative care and children's hospice up in Brooklyn Center. Only one of 3 in the United States. There are 50 in England. I've done work in a number of them there. But there are only 3 in the United States. And so this is a place for children who are living with a life-limiting and life-threatening condition to come for respite so that their family can get respite for a few days or to come to die or for their memorial. In July of last year, 13 families who'd had a child die came to meet with us at Crescent Cove, and I was asked to guide a remembrance service. There were lots of other activities surrounding that, but we then had about a half hour for just remembering. And I shared this story that had been given to me by one of my English colleagues, say Neil to me, N-E-I-L, a boy's name. Say Neil to me, the time of concern is over. No longer are we asked how we're doing. Never is the name of my son mentioned to me. It hurts to bury his memory in silence. When he was in the flesh, he was just minutes away. You do not need to remind me how little you understand. I cannot forget. I would not if I could. I do not ask you to walk the same road I'm walking. Say Neil to me, say Neil to me, use my boy's name. I shared that story, and a father came up to me afterwards and said, could I get a copy of that? He said, that's my story. And he sent me his version, say even to me. His son's name is Even. And he also was losing the stories of people being willing to share those kinds of things with others. So take a breath. I'm giving you lots of information. Take a sigh. Just a bit more before we talk a little bit about responses. Talked about conspicuous and internal losses, the loss of dreams, the loss of our stories, and some of the task of those around us. How do we begin to move forward? So just a few suggestions. One is, this is wisdom that someone shared with me along the way, you can't start a new chapter in your life if you're only rereading the old chapter. You can't start a new chapter in your life if you're only rereading the old chapter. And so what some people are suggesting is that lots of people, especially those of you who are bereaved, dealing with death, contrasted with other losses, is that we often are remembering the past, and we focus on past stories. And so some writers have said the old concept of the need to accept reality when a person dies does not allow much room for becoming and limits the range of stories that can be recognized. This approach appears to treat identity as a cloak that must be worn. Remember the black armband? Remember wearing the black garments for 6 months or a year? It was a kind of an announcement to your community that a death had occurred. And so while we don't do that anymore, it's as if we still are focused on the past. And what these writers are suggesting is a new kind of question we might ask ourselves and might ask of others is, who are you becoming? Who are you becoming since Marge's death? Ted, who are you becoming since your grandson's death by overdose in 2017? How has your life changed? Here's the way that Janet Yolen began to talk about these kinds of changes. They're slow and we move along with them. Her husband had died of cancer. Grief is not getting any easier, but it's becoming more ordinary. This is after some weeks and some months. Grief is not a one-time thing, not several days, weeks, or months, but is a visitor who's moved in my house for good and occasionally helps out around the house. Do you know what she's getting at there? That if you are the widow or the widower, if you have good friends, some of them will even show up in the 3rd year, the 4th year, and offer you some acts of kindness, or go with you to the cemetery, or gather with you around Remembrance Day. And so that grief can have its benefits along with its sadness. Grief is not unwelcome in my house, for it reminds me of how much I have lost, there's the grieving, and how blessed I was to have so much to lose. The degree of the grieving often relates to the amount of love and attachment that we had to the things that we've lost. Sheryl Sandberg, also a widow, said a childhood friend of mine who is now a rabbi recently told me the most powerful one-line prayer he had ever read was, "Let me not die while I am still alive." Who are you becoming? Let me not die while I am still alive. I'm not done yet. There's some things I want to do in her memory and his memory. And on it goes in those kinds of ways. Kathy Phelan Watkins looks toward an ambiguous but attractive future after looking back at her historical landscape. She says, "I'm now in a new pool. A deep, dark, unsettling is around me. Everything lies in these waters, and the smallest stone, no discernible shape or certainty going round, but I'm not overwhelmed by that. In fact, I find the lack of definition positive." And she's willing to embrace the ambiguity, the mystery of what it's going to be like as she begins to move forward. Here again is my own story, 2 forms of it. About 6 months after Marge died, And I guess I felt in some ways that I had died also. That was a slip of the tongue, but I felt that at times. I was struggling with the words I mentioned earlier, being a widower, of being a solo man, being single. While I knew there was truth in them, there were parts of that I just didn't want to hear that particular day, or I was struggling with my willingness to the Rumi poem to embrace that. And I shared it with a male friend of mine, and he helped me to do what we call reframing. Reframing. Here's what he said to me. Ted, you've never been single. I said, what are you talking about? He said, anyone who has a collection of friends and supportive family in their lives is never single. Ted, you have always had a collective of caring people in your lives. I am a member of your present collective. Ted, you are not single. It didn't change anything, and yet it changed everything. It's what we call a reframing, to look at our situation in a slightly different way. Here's the version I wrote for myself about 3 months after Marge died, embracing what we call a dual process, that I need times and places and venues like this coalition of this grief coalition to do some grieving work, but I also need times and places and venues, and I hope that can happen here as well, for restoration work, and that I can move between those two circles, oscillate, if you will, between times for grieving and time for restoration and resiliency. And so here's what I wrote about 3 months after my wife died. I will color this time with more than a black armband, a past marker of death. There's the grieving. I will reach for brilliant, bold, bright colors, subdued beiges, blues, and blush. I yearn for an array of color similar to the rainbow of flowers sent so soon after her death. There's the grieving again, reminding me of the colorful life that we shared and that I can still have. There I am, oscillating, reframing, moving between the grieving as well as the losses that have been a part of the life. So this oscillation motto, I would urge you to consider. There's an image of it on some of the pages out on the table, the handouts from previous sessions. But it involves that we begin to move forward with our own resources and some of our own strengths. William Stafford calls it the thread. What is it that grounds you? What is it that helps you to feel solid on the ground? William Stafford said, there's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. You suffer, you get old. Nothing can stop time's unfolding, but you don't ever let go of your thread. What is your thread? I would urge you to consider that. Is it your own faith? Is it the circle of care in your life? Ted, you've never been single? Or is it perhaps Mother Nature as autumn begins to surround us? Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky farmer and poet, said, when despair for the world grows inside me and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear for what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down in the peace of wild things. I go outside where the wood drake rests in the beauty of the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the peace of still water. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I look up at the stars and the moon, and I'm free. What are your threads that help you with your own healing? Is it being with people? Is it comfort food? Is it a grief coalition? Is it your own faith? Is it, as I've heard so many people say about their therapist or their family, my worker believed in me before I believed in me? The faith of others that we can get through this, and off we might go. Take a breath, that's a lot. Trying to give you a bit of an overview of both how grief comes, as being human as a guest house, the differences between loss and grief, and then some of the kinds of responses that we might have as we share our stories. Let's take a moment if there are questions. If you'll raise your hand so I can point my ear in your direction. And if you'll use your big voice, go back to nursery school and remember to use your big voice so that I can hear you. I need to repeat it because of the people who are getting this via recording can hear the question. Who has a question for me or a comment?
I have a comment. I just really appreciate you saying that about saying the person's name, because I've heard before when you don't say the person's name, it's as if they've never existed.
Right. Well, there's an old aphorism that I didn't say, is that if something's unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. How do you live with cancer unless you can say the word cancer? How do you live with being a widow or widower without using that word or the D word, the death word, and so on? But what I'm also saying is it's also important that hospice rule around the world is not about dying 6 months or fewer. The hospice rule around the world is to live as fully as you can for as long as you can. A friend of mine who was a teacher at the University of Minnesota resisted hospice for a long time until he was told that he could graduate from hospice. If he happened to get better, he could have another 6 months. And so he said, oh, okay, sign me up. I want to live as long as I can for as... on I went. So there. Another question quickly. It's getting close to the 7:45 time. Question or comment? Thank you for that one. Just use the names. Okay, I'll linger as you begin to move toward the groups, and I've got some of my books here if you're interested in those in the bag, and I can see you at that time. But thank you for listening. Good wishes to you. Susan's going to come up and tell you in a nice way where to go.
Thank you, Ted. Next week, Ted will be back with us, so you get to hear him some more. So if you have questions that you didn't ask and you might have them for next week, bring them along. I'm going to announce where the groups are going to be. We will be in the groups until 8:45. Well, no, not 9 o'clock. John, is that 9 o'clock will we use? Okay, we'll adjourn the groups at 9 o'clock. The groups are going to be on this floor and some are going to be downstairs. There is an elevator, so if you need that, it's available. So we're going to have 4 loss of spouse groups. 2 of them are... No, it looks like 3 of them are downstairs, or 4 of them are downstairs. So, John Dahl, you're going to be in the music room? Yes.
Should we play the instruments?
Phyllis Anderson, you're going to be in room number 11. That's also downstairs. Jack Anderson, you're going to be downstairs in Fellowship Hall. And I have Fellowship Hall 1 and 2. We're going to just have 2 of the groups or being coroners in that room. So there'll be 2 groups in the room, but you'll have to just divide up. And then Jan Nelson Schwartz, you're going to be also in Fellowship Hall downstairs. That's loss of spouse. Loss of child is going to be in room 9 downstairs with Nancy Matheson. Loss of parent in the fireside room with Tom Schlor. Loss of sibling or friend with Sue Thompson, and that's in the library. Separated or divorced and caretaker will be in the small office upstairs. Charlotte Drone, that will be your group. Suicide survivors with Dan Noman will be in the sanctuary. So that's this room. You'll just have to pick a corner to be. You might want to just come up here. There's a bench and a chair, so. Anybody have questions? There also are some refreshments. There's water and snacks, and they're on a table out here, and I think you can take them to your rooms if you want to pick them up now. Thanks again for being with us.